What can Dax Shepard, a dragon movie, and The Ugly American teach us about God as Father? Next on Church Without Walls. Happy Father's Day, first of all. And I'd like to say that Church Without Walls isn't your typical Sunday morning service. So if this is the first time you're tuning in and you're expecting a Father's Day message with 3 points, a poem, and a prayer, what we intend to do here is really celebrate the true nature of God and the person of Jesus Christ. And to do so, we challenge the status quo and we challenge the thinking that maybe you've grown up with. And we ask you to try us on like a pair of shoes. Now, we are not a pair of Bruno Malle's. I mean, if our show was a shoe, what would it be, Poe?
Twinkle Toes.
You mean like Dorothy's slippers? I think that's a little flashy.
Shoes.
They're kids' shoes. I was thinking more like a pair of Crocs or something. What do you think? Where's my... So anyway, we're informal, but what we intend to do is to challenge the norm. Because we don't think the norm is working. We think the norm may have strayed from the original intent of Christianity, but we don't ask you to agree with everything we say. As a matter of fact, a lot of what we say is in the form of a question, because we don't know. But we suspect we know what's wrong, even though we might not know what's completely right. So we're going to do this today a little bit with, a Father's Day message in understanding what can fathers teach us more about the person of God and our relationship to him. Forgive me, my glasses are cloudy. It's kind of embarrassing. Check Payton cam for a second. Okay. So the Sparrow's Call is, of course, a place where all are welcome at the table. And we'll talk about that a little more today. We released some videos this week with biologist Dennis Venema, and they're getting a lot of interest. But Father's Day, The Ugly American, dragon movie. But first, Dax Shepard. Dax Shepard is married to Kristen Bell, and she's a Christian, and there's been some wonderful interviews lately with the two of them talking about how that worked out between them, because they seem like an unlikely pair. But he's been in movies, he's an actor, and he's kind of best known for his role as Crosby on the show Parenthood, which we've been watching. We're in like season 5 right now. There's an episode in season 5 called Limbo. I think it's episode 17. And it's an episode, the whole show is about family dynamics. And so there's arguing and there's loving and there's making up, and it's all about relationships, and relationships end and relationships reconcile. And at one point, the whole family is sitting at a dinner table, kind of Blue Bloods like, and they're talking about the upcoming christening of Crosby and Jasmine's baby daughter, who's, 6 weeks old, 6 months old maybe. And Crosby and Jasmine are not religious. They're not really even Christian per se followers, but they're going through with this because Jasmine's mom, the mother-in-law, is very religious, kind of Baptist, and expects the child to be baptized, christened. And they're arguing about godparents at the table because things are revealed at this dinner that other family members didn't know. And it gets to a point where Crosby loses it. All the pressure on these situations. You've been through it if you've helped plan a wedding or plan any family function where things get in the way. Planning gets in the way, and egos get in the way, and expectations lead to disappointment. Well, anyway, this is happening all at this dinner table. And finally, Crosby, the father, gets so frustrated. He said, all of this is unnecessary. None of this is necessary. I don't see why we need to do this, why there's so much pressure to do it now. And the mother-in-law says, well, because you agreed to have baby Aida baptized. And so just because there's drama going around here doesn't mean that it should affect poor baby Aida and disrupt her baptism. And Crosby says, but she doesn't have any unrest. She's peaceful. She's sleeping upstairs. She doesn't know any of this is happening. None of this is necessary. Why are we rushing into this? I don't believe in a God who would send a baby to hell. Yeah, really dramatic moment, and it's one that I think captures something that's happened in other families and even in Christendom at large. There are people who believe that God would send a baby to hell to burn for an eternity in eternal fire because the baby did not have a holy man sprinkle holy water on the baby's forehead. Now, you might think this is strange, but if you look at church history, even if you've been in a very strict church, even in our day, you'll find out that there are these doctrines that people hold that, well, as C.S. Lewis once said, sound like we're not worshiping God, but we're worshiping an omnipotent fiend, a tyrant, a devil almost. To think that God would send a baby to hell for not being baptized. And yet, in church history, that very subject has led to decrees and confessions and being included in things and excluded or excommunicated even. If you know the history of the church, you know that a man named Servetus, and it's not just a Catholic thing, Servetus was a Protestant and he was murdered. He was burned at the stake because he differed with John Calvin over the very subject we're talking about, the baptism of a baby and the Trinity. And so they tied him to a stake and lit him on fire. This happens. People have gone to war over something like this now, and it's biblical. What do I mean by that? Well, some people believe, on their understanding of the Bible, that we shouldn't baptize children. Infant baptism is wrong because the child doesn't have a chance itself to express its free will or volition. So some have been led to look at, say, the salvation, the confession of the Philippian jailer in front of Paul and Silas and how he was an adult. And you see in the New Testament, you see adults being baptized after they confess faith in Jesus Christ. And that's kind of the mode you see in the New Testament. And yet you see also in the Old Testament, you see the dedication of Samuel by his devout mother. As a gratitude to God, she brings him to Eli and gives him to Eli at the temple to administer there as a servant. And so people look at the dedication of Samuel and say, I want to do that with my child. I want to tell God that we're giving our child back to you. And, it's kind of a hopeful thing. And then to some, it's like Jasmine and Crosby. They don't really care. They're just satisfying their mother-in-law's wishes just to shut her up, right? And yet, in our day, people might not be burnt at the stake over this. They might not be tied to a pyre and lit on fire. There might not be wars over this. And yet, people would still might write a letter if you disagree with them on this to get you fired if you're a university professor. So there still is this craziness surrounding certain doctrines that people have elevated to a level that just makes God ugly and absurd. And so what do we learn about this? Well, to help us out, I'd like to share with... Oh, you might have to do more than one drawing because look at this. You're like almost already done.
No, there's all this, and I'm going to put stuff here. I'm not done with this and this.
So you're going to layer it more, so you're not almost already done, because I've got like more to say. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So Pay is still working. Where was I? Oh, to help me out, this show has a little help from our friends today. I've recruited one of my wife's favorite actors, Matthew McConaughey. As a matter of fact, This came to us yesterday, actually. We watched this movie yesterday, Reign of Fire. Now, listen to this. In 2002, there was a movie made called Reign of Fire. Most of you probably haven't seen this movie, although when you hear who's in the cast, you'd be like, how was this movie not a blockbuster? I mean, it was starring Matthew McConaughey and Christian Bale and Gerard Butler. I mean, in one movie, you have Leonidas and Batman and a Texan. I mean, how could this go wrong, right? It didn't really go wrong. It's a movie about dragons who are released from centuries slumber by miners in England. And then, of course, these dragons take over the globe and Homo sapiens fight back. And eventually, two worlds collide when the British, who are, barely surviving the onslaught of the dragons, meet some usual suspects in this alliance against the dread enemy. And so, hold on a second, folks. What you're about to see, and if you haven't seen it, it's probably worth your time. It's a fun movie. But what you are about to see is the introduction of when the characters all come together and meet. And I want to use it as a foundation for a discussion on Father's Day. And it'll come together after this, trust me.
Oh dear.
Greedy! Greedy! I've got to go.
All right, lads, this isn't a drill. Move it along. Get those out. One's greedy. Another one's Garrett. He's quick. All right, come on, Ian, come on. Extra shots. Give me the basic thing. Come on. We haven't got all day. I'll take those.
Marauders. Years since we've seen them. Look on the bright side. At least we're not alone.
Only one thing worse than a dragon. Americans.
What a dump.
Who's in charge? Well, that'll be you then.
Only one thing worse than a dragon. Americans. To me, that's the best line in the movie, right? Here come these brash, loud Americans to the rescue again with for these helpless Brits who have a dragon tormenting them, and here come the Americans. But you know by the way, that's the best part of the movie, so you don't have to watch it. But you know, it's got some good writing and some great characters. But yeah, if you even recognize Matthew McConaughey, my wife didn't recognize him. She's like, "That's Matthew McConaughey." But here's the point: the ugly American, it's a real thing. It is. If you've traveled to Europe, if you've talked to anyone who lives in Europe, especially in the tourist areas, the ugly American, I know it's a caricature in movies and so forth, but it's actually a real live thing. People all over the place who really appreciate and are grateful for American tourist dollars are not always grateful for the American tourist, because they come off as entitled, as loud, as brash, as egotistical, as uncaring, as thoughtless about other cultures. You know, kind of like, hey, we're here, let's get the party started. And this is a truism, it's just not the whole truth. It's if your only perception of Americans is the rich tourist, the Thurston Howell III and his wife Lovey, who come and have all these expectations and needs and wants, and that's your interpretation of Americans, you're going to think all Americans are ugly, and you're going to think America is ugly and what's going on over there. It's true. But when you understand something that the average Joe Sixpack doesn't get to travel to Europe, right? And I'm not talking about the 17-year-old kid who takes a gap year to, you know, backpack through the hostels. I'm talking about the vast majority of people who travel, Americans to exotic places. They have money, and this is not to say that all rich people are ugly. Although there's, I think, a higher percentage of wealthy people who travel abroad who happen to put off an image that is unflattering of what real America looks like. And we even see that in America itself with, you know, the collision of worlds in the political world, what we call flyover country, I would call Joe Sixpack, and how they differ from the people on the coast and so forth. So we understand this idea, and you know, and not to say that poor Americans or middle-class Americans can't be ugly. They can be just as ugly. But this idea of the ugly American, I mean, you can draw it out, you can spell it out, you can write it. It's a cliche because it happens over and over and over again. It's almost like the wicked stepmother kind of thing. There's some traction there. And if you're a stepmother, please don't think I'm calling you wicked, but you get the understanding. You have to beat off that impression not only when you meet your stepchildren, but with, you know, when you meet the sphere of influence surrounding your new family. So what does ugly American idea show? Well, I want to use it to demonstrate that there is an ugliness in Christianity that we've been labeled with. And some people, especially young people in our country, and some people in other countries, view Americans, Christians, as the same way as the ugly American, as people in Europe view the ugly American. And so they dismiss everything. They dismiss the whole faith. They don't actually see Christ through the forest of Christians or Christianity. And the famous quote by Gandhi, who said, "I love your Christ. I love your Christ. Everything about him is amazing and marvelous, but I just don't like your Christians." And he's noting here the disconnect sometimes you see between Christ and what he said and those who claim the name of Christ and how we act. And you can't dismiss that, although many Christians try to dismiss that. You can't, because you find out that even Jesus brought this up, that this is a so-called biblical thing that people have been taking the Lord's name in vain since there was a connection between God and man. So probably as early as the garden and Cain, you might say. And this is one of those occasions where we talk about good people and bad people. And once in a while you hear a sociologist or somebody say that, you know what, there's Payton Camp. You know what, there's good people and there's bad people in every group. And we accept that. We kind of accept that. Yeah, sure, there's good people and bad people in every group. There's the bad apples in this group. And we'd like to see things kind of like as if it's literature or if it's something on the silver screen where characters are fixed, right? Very few characters are rounded and changed, but most characters are fixed. This guy's the villain, and this guy's the hero. And here's the heroine, here's the damsel in distress. And we want to write the narrative of our lives with certainty, with fixity like that. And the truth is, there are no good people and bad people. There's just people with the capacity to live to a great good and a damnable evil. And this takes place oftentimes from moment to moment in our lives. And the hero, tomorrow's hero could be yesterday's villain, and today's hero could be tomorrow's villain. Moment to moment, and it happens. Now, there's some that live way on the end of one spectrum. I'm not saying that Joseph Stalin is the same as Mother Teresa. I'm saying they live on the continuum we call humanity. And we slide up and down that continuum. And some of us may never get as far to the, let's call it left, as Joseph Stalin or Jeffrey Dahmer. And most of us will never get within glimpse of Teresa of Calcutta, or I don't know, whoever your favorite hero is. You know, Ravi Zacharias or John Wayne or whoever your Matthew McConaughey. Sorry, Wendy. Most of us may never get, within glimpse of them. But we live somewhere on the continuum, and sometimes that pendulum on that continuum can swing. In the midst of some of my most sacred prayers, praying for an enemy, I allowed anger to get the better of me, and my thoughts were those that were condemned by Christ on the Mount, who said, if you have anger in your heart toward your brother, you've committed murder. And I've committed murder in some of my most sacred prayers. I've committed adultery, forgive me, in some of my most sacred prayers. And this happens because we live in a world where thoughts and actions make up who we are. So what can the ugly American, what can a dragon movie and a baptism on some show teach us about who and what God is? There have been things that we've accepted about God that are lies. They're damnable lies, and yet we've sanctified them, and we've made them Christian, and we've celebrated them, and we've written them into our creeds and our confessions, and we teach them to our children in Sunday school. And eventually some of them grow up and they start to rethink these things critically, and they say, if God would send a baby to hell for his parents not sprinkling him on the head, that God has earned his atheist. That God is not worthy of worship. And I agree. How much of what we believe is not true, but is something that we believe is true? How much of what we believe has been implanted by the adversary to actually deface and dethrone the true nature of a loving God? So one of the things I'd like to say to you today has nothing to do with your earthly father, and I hope you've all had a wonderful father. I am thrilled on Father's Day and Mother's Day and Siblings Day or whatever. I am always thrilled to see people celebrating their family. It warms my heart, even though I know that there's people that are on Facebook that see 35 of their friends sharing a profile picture of their father, and it makes them cringe because their father was a monster or because their father was absentee. And so I always think of them. My heart goes out to them when I think of them, and yet we shouldn't steal the joy of those who have great gratitude in their hearts. Who have gratitude in their hearts because they've had a wonderful experience with a father. And yet, what do we find when we actually look at the writers of Scripture and how they define the love of God, and the two major ways in which they define the love of God are depicting God as a father and depicting God as a bridegroom, and then defining that through stories, through the story of the prodigal son, through the story of Hosea, or Yahweh in the Old Testament, who had, yes, he had multiple wives because polygamy wasn't condemned. He was married to Israel and Judah, and he took them back even after their unfaithfulness and their adultery. And he yearned for restoration and reconciliation. It's that kind of husband that you have. The kind of father who would look on the roof in the heat of the day just hoping to get a glimpse of his son returning home. This is our Father. This is our God. And yet we can paint him as a monster, as somebody who's petty and ridiculous and even a tyrant. And religion does this. It's not atheism or Satanism that does this. They might be glad for the ally. Or they might just laugh when it happens. Or that might actually be the incentive for them to be the way they are, to satisfy their righteousness and their choices, because the God that is presented to them is foul and is demonic. And when is an atheist actually righteous? When is an atheist the actually most courageous or bravest person in the room? It's when the God that's being proffered is hideous. That's when the atheist is righteous. That's when it's right that justice prevail, though the heavens may fall. And oftentimes the Christian God is presented as a monster by the very people who claim the name of Christ. I used to think, now look, let's say this. Let's say you've grown up in a fundamentalist church or an evangelical church or a very strict church that, or, Catholic or Lutheran church that taught that God is so austere that unless you knew the secret handshake and you went through the secret rituals or the open rituals, unless you were baptized in communion and blah, 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 and died in a state of grace, you were going to burn in hell for eternity. Let's say you believe that, right? Let's say you grew up believing that if your son was a homosexual, he'd burn in hell for being, sexually broken and driven in that direction. So let's say you grew up believing that about God, that God was that kind of a God. Then the worst thing in your mind as a parent, maybe the greatest disappointment you may have as a parent, is the realization that your child is choosing to live his or her life, even your adult child, as an atheist, right? That's the absolute worst thing that can happen in your world, because their eternal salvation depends on that, right? And you don't want them to burn in hell. You don't want them to have that kind of a destiny. And a part of me grew up thinking that maybe the worst disappointment that can happen for a parent is to realize that their child is choosing atheism. I've come to think that there's something worse than that. I think the greatest disappointment for a parent isn't to raise a child that doesn't know their father, but it's to raise you thought I was going to say a bad word, didn't you? Because I said a bad word yesterday, and I had to put $1 in the cuss bucket. No, I was going to clean it up for Sunday, but very good of you. That was very good of you to catch that, Payton. Payton's bleeped me out. No, I think the greatest disappointment for a parent isn't to raise a child that doesn't know their father or is confused by their father, but to raise someone who's taken the Lord's name in vain. To raise someone who has all the accoutrements and wears all the paraphernalia of religion and takes the Lord's mantle on him, and yet passes by the beaten man on the Jericho road. or stands on the corner looking at sinners surrounding Christ and points a finger and decries not only the sinners, but the shepherd, the great physician who's among them. You remember the writer of Matthew talks about this great judgment and where we all come before Jesus, groups come before Jesus. It's not the atheists that Jesus says to depart from him. I never knew you. It's not. Jesus says that to Christians because, they protest. They say, wait a minute, Lord, but we're Christians. We wore your name. We used your name. We fought in your name. We worked in your name. And Jesus says, depart from me, you workers of iniquity. I never knew you. This is a hard lesson for us to learn. Might we be working iniquity by what we believe about God the Father? Now look, God has made it really easy for us to understand him. And I know the Bible oftentimes makes it confusing. I know your church oftentimes makes it confusing. I know your denomination or your tradition oftentimes makes it confusing. But if you truly understand God and the word pictures that he shares with you, all you have to do is ask yourself, would a good father do that to a child? Would a good husband do that to a wife? And the stunning conclusion you come to is that it's not atheism that makes atheists. It's toxic Christianity that makes atheists. And their observations of that toxic Christianity might be spot on. Even their conclusions are forebode. Let me share this with you. This is Madeleine LEngle. I certainly love to read Madeleine LEngle. And this is from a series of books. This one is called The Irrational Season. She writes, during my journey through life, I've moved in and out of agnosticism and even atheism as I become bewildered by what mankind has done to God. And so too often I see God in man's image rather than the other way around. But I cannot live for long in this dead-end world, but return to the more open places of my childhood's intuitive love of God, where I know that all creatures are the concern of the God who created the galaxies and who nevertheless notes the fall of each sparrow. Another who writes on a similar topic, George MacDonald, says, good souls many will one day be horrified at the things that they now believe of God. And we, I like we instead of they, we can make little progress in the knowledge of God while holding evil things true of him. If I can share one thing with you today that I hope you take away from this message, and I'm almost done, so we're about to come upon Payton, but if you take one thing away from today is understand God as a father, and not just any father, but as the best father. This is what Pinnacle theology holds, that God is the best of fathers. So it's basically like this. If you can imagine the best father in your experience, and you might have been lucky enough to know him. He might have been your father, or he might have been the father of your best friend, or he might have been the father you watched every day at dinner when you watched the Andy Griffith Show, or Courtship with Eddie's Father, or what have you, or Judge Hardy, and then the Andy Hardy movies on Saturday morning, or Atticus Finch when you watched or read To Kill a Mockingbird. We all have these pictures of what a great father is. Granted, some of us have the most cherished memories of that relationship with a great father. Just ask yourself, when you're in doubt about God and when you're wondering about God, if you've had a great father, would my dad have done that to any one of us? In our worst moments, would my dad have done that? Because however great a father you had, however full of sacrificial, unconditional love that your father showed you and your siblings and even your mother, realize this: it is a paucity compared to the love of our Creator, our Maker, and our Savior. But God has given us those earthly loves so that we could begin with our finite minds to even begin to comprehend the love of an infinite being who stepped into finitude, who robed himself in the clothes of a slave, who died in the place of a criminal, who rose again to restore us to the family that we become estranged, to bring us back as a brother's keeper. That's who Jesus was. Jesus was what Cain should have been. Jesus was what Adam should have been as a husband, what Cain should have been as a brother. And he brings us back as our keeper. And so if you take one thing away from this, now I know I'm stepping on a lot of toes because you've grown up maybe in the church with these traditions, but if you think back about it, you might be bruised, you might be scarred, you might be wounded over it. I had a woman say to me this week who's gone through a change in her faith. And she's kind of walked away from the faith of her childhood because it contained many of these ugly elements we're talking about. And she's progressed in her journey of faith and truth to a new place in what she would call her faith. It's still Christianity. Her love of God and her trust in Jesus hasn't wavered. It's grown stronger in her greater understanding of the character of God. And yet she's been bruised by her family. And they haven't accepted her. They've rejected her because of the change in her thinking, because she's strayed from the tribe. And they've rejected her. And the hurt is so great. She said to me, it's easier for me to say I'm an atheist. It would be easier. I don't think she said it, but she said it would be easier for me to say I'm an atheist because they already think that of me anyway. Because I've changed my thinking on a couple of these doctrines, and they can't fathom it. And so the shaming and the shunning that comes along with it, it's just not worth it. I'd just rather dismiss it and just agree, just say, yeah, I'm an atheist. Let's leave it at that. Can you imagine the pain that surrounds that? A brother or a sister in Christ who feels that estranged from the table of the Father. Have you felt that? If you have, come to the Sparrow's Call. That's not the God you have. That's not the God we serve. That's not our Father. Our earthly Father wouldn't treat us that way, and our Heavenly Father certainly wouldn't treat us that way. You are loved. You are beloved to a degree that we will never fathom, that we may never grow comfortable with in our understanding because it seems too good to be true. As far as good people and bad people, using the language of accommodation, we could say there are good people and bad people in every group. There is the ugly atheist, the hostile atheist who's been maybe wronged or hurt so much, and the only thing they live for and they're usually miserable and humorless, but they live for the opportunity to stick their thumb in their theist brother's eyes, or or they hate their background so much and what they were brought up in that they live to tear it down and to throw stones at it, and that kind of bitterness is what keeps them warm. There is that, and yet some of the most beautiful people I've met do not claim a relationship with God. They don't claim to believe in God, whether agnostic or atheist. Some of the most Christ-like people I've ever met have been atheists or agnostics or even people of another faith. How does that compute? How does it compute some of the cruelest, most caustic and toxic people I've met have been those who have proclaimed the name of Jesus? I've met those people that Gandhi talked about. I, for a time, may have been one of those people that Gandhi talked about. The ugly American, the ugly Christian. We live on that continuum. How do you explain that? Well, the truth is, maybe the greatest disappointment for a parent isn't to raise somebody who's got doubt or questioning about whether there is a God or there isn't a God. Maybe the worst thing in the world is to realize that your child has grown up under your influence and has chosen to reject, to love their fellow man, to show them mercy, to have a tenderness that Christ calls for, and yet they proclaim the name of Christ. They dress in Christian clothes and listen to Christian songs, and they broaden their phylacteries in the streets, and they quote scripture with the best of them, and they pass right by the beaten man on the Jericho road. I think that would break my heart. I asked recently in social media, as a parent, as a father, mother, guardian, what are some of your most joy-filled moments with your children? As for me, I could echo what the Apostle John says, there's no greater joy than to see your children walk in the truth. I get that. And if what he means by that, because John talks about love more than any of the other disciples, as John talks about that our discipleship is one of love, I think what John means by that is that, to echo what Paul says, that love is the greatest of these. That's the truth. And to share that in instances, not just where it's easy with family and friends, but where it's hard with neighbors and enemies, with people who don't deserve it. My greatest joy as a parent is to see my children act in tenderness towards others, because that's when I see God in them. And I'd like to say I see great parenting in them. I see a reflection of my lovely wife. But the truth is, that's when I see God in them. That's when I see them as image bearers of God. When they're wronged and they don't react in vituperation. When they react thoughtfully and with understanding, and even with mercy and grace. That's the life that Christ is calling us to. And that's my prayer as a father and as a son. So that's all I've got for you today. That's the Crocs, or the comfortable loafers, that is church without walls today. Thank you for joining us. It's time to go to Payton. Payton, you want to share what you got?
Yeah, let me just finish this kitty.
You just got to finish. So you did do 2 drawings. I was right. I talked too long.
Okay, so I'll start with this one.
Okay.
So I started with this kitty here, and a big, it's one of those kind of tubes that the kitty can lay in. That's the youngest baby kitty. And this is the mommy kitty. It's really fuzzy, and since this is a tube, it's not just like a flat cat bed. That's where the other arms are, behind the cat bed. Or squishing into the back or something. Okay, and then this is a cat tree. This is one little sticks with a string and the pom-pom that cat could play with. And then this is a big cat tree, and on the first floor, there is a little kitty in a yellow cat bed. And on the top floor, there's another one of those little pom-poms. And then there's a little fluffy black kitty like Cassie, except fatter.
So it's a family of cats.
Yeah, I've
Nice.
been wanting another kitty, but Mom won't get me one.
I think Mom is wise in that because we have a lot of animals. Okay, what else you got?
And this is the Shire.
The Shire.
This is the house on the other side of the wall. This is the wall. This is some vines on the wall.
Do the hobbits live there?
Maybe.
Okay.
And then this is a bench. And this is grass, our fake grass. And then this is our purple flowers. And then this is some of the pool. And yeah.
Oh, that might be our Shire. Well, that's beautiful. Pay, thanks for sharing that. You want to say anything before we sign off? How about Happy Father's Day to your grandpas?
Happy Father's Day, and I like pizza.
Who doesn't like pizza? I'm having barbecue. We're picking up barbecue. If you've never been to Arizona, barbecue. It's not Kansas City. I know. I'm going to get emails. Kansas City barbecue. I get it. I've been to Kansas City. I bowed to Kansas City. Not to Texas. We got better barbecue than Texas. Sorry, guys. But it's worth your time if you come. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.